Welcome to the Brooklyn Rail's 966th New Social Environment. I'm Chloe, Director of Programs here at the Brooklyn Rail, and I have the privilege of being your MC today for a conversation featuring Brendan Fernandes and Elizabeth Buhe. We're thrilled to welcome poet Bob Holman here to close today's program. And now I'll introduce today's guest and host. Internationally recognized Canadian artist Brendan Fernandes works at the intersection of dance and visual arts. Brendan's projects address issues of race, queer culture, migration, protest, and other forms of collective movement. Brendan's projects take on hybrid forms, part ballet, part queer dance party, part political protest, but always rooted in collaboration and solidarity. And our host today, Elizabeth Buhe, is a widely published critic and art historian based in New York. Her writing addresses alternative modernisms and spatial ontologies in Europe and North America in the 20th and 21st centuries. Elizabeth has taught at the Whitney Museum and at Fordham University and is a contributing critic for the Brooklyn Rail. And with that, I'm going to pass it over to Elizabeth.
Thank you so much, Chloe. It's a pleasure to be with you today. Thanks so much to Brendan for your time. I'm really excited to talk with you today about this work. Thank you to the Rail team, Fong, Eleanor, and Carolyn, and also, of course, to the gallery, to Courtney and Susan for your help along the way. So hopefully you've had a chance to pop into Chelsea and see Brendan's show, but if you haven't yet, you have until, I believe it's the 27th of January to do that. And what I'm going to do is kick us off by explaining briefly what we see in the show. So you can, for those of you who may not have had a chance to see it yet, understand what's in the show, and then Brendan and I will start to talk about the work. So as you see here in this installation shot of the gallery, this is the larger of two galleries. There's a smaller one behind. Brendan is exhibiting 7 photographs, and you can see a few of those on the wall. They're black and white digital prints, and that's from a series called As One from 2017. And the works present 2 white dancers from the American Ballet Theater, one female and one male, and we'll see close-ups of these works later, but as you can tell from the install shot a little bit, these dancers are holding different poses alongside rectangular plinths and the plinths hold West African masks that are held in the Museum of the University at Buffalo. And the poses that these dancers hold often appear as if they are embracing the masks, but they're not actually touching them. And this is a body of work, some of which Brendan has shown before. And then on the floor, he's presenting 3 wooden headrests that are enlarged beyond what a historic example would be that you might see in a museum. And these are presented on brightly colored checked cloths. And as you can see a little bit from the little, what look like fingers, the headrests are slightly anthropomorphic in the sense that they allude to a human hand or a human foot. And so there's clearly a connection in the evocation of the body between the photographs and the headrest. And these are objects that you might imagine historically or today would cradle a head, or might protect against evil spirits for someone who is sleeping. So as a first question for Brendan, I'd like to ask you to talk a little bit about both of these series, but particularly about connecting them, since the photographs are a body of work that you've been working with for some years, but as I understand, the headrests are more recent. So can you tell us a little bit about how you thought about exhibiting these works together?
Yeah, definitely. First and foremost, thank you so much for everyone joining today and listening, and to the team at the Brooklyn Rail, and to Elizabeth for spending time, and of course to Susan England and the team at the gallery as well, and to Monique Melange Gallery in Chicago who represents me. Super excited to talk about this work, and and also to kind of unpack some of the juxtapositions between As One and the headrests. I made the work As One in 2017. It was a commission originally for the Seattle Art Museum for a show called The Skies, Masks in Global Africa. And that was a film piece. And then I did the photographs with the University of Buffalo and kind of worked with the two dancers you mentioned from American Ballet Theater. And, for me, coming from, a fifth generation African background, being, fifth generation Kenyan, I kind of always have been like, thinking through questions of, the masked object, the object that kind of hides identity, but also creates identity. Like, what does that, what does that object kind of mean? And then when I moved to New York in 2005 to do the Whitney Independent Study Program, mask became another kind of like, symbol for identity, as West African immigrants are selling them on the streets of Canal Street, and people are buying them as New York souvenirs. And so I was always really curious about the kind of the cultural value between artifact and souvenir. But in this series, I'm really sort of thinking about the kind of cultural narrative, the colonial narrative of these objects through movement, through dance. When these objects were removed from their place of origin and taken out of the continent and brought into the museum, we removed their bodies, we removed the dance. All of these objects come with like a specific, cultural masquerade. I should say or posit, I've done other work with masks that are, seemingly like become symbols of Africa, kind of like a cultural monolith, and they represent an object from East Africa, from Kenyan culture, but those are inauthentic because we don't have masquerade or mask culture, but somebody has created this object. So there's a lot of kind of like mythicism, questions of authenticity to these objects. So these are specifically have specific dances like attached to them. And so sort of thinking about my background when I was a trained ballet dancer, when I moved from Kenya to Canada, I started training in ballet, partially because it was a means of daycare, a means of finding, like support after school. My parents put me in classes. I was very much, did not know that I was going to take this on as a profession. Neither did my parents. But I started thinking in this body of work specifically, how the ballet body, the colonial French body that colonized parts of West Africa, removed these objects and stilled them in the museum, which is also a French institution, but how the two together kind of creates almost like a respect, an apology, an acknowledgement. And so, in French court, in Louis XIV's court, he choreographed his court to bow to him. So ballet began as a way to bow to the king, to break your body, to kind of give, a sense of submissiveness to the authority. And so within my work, I'm questioning a lot of these kind of questions of Western canons, of museums, of authority, but like also ballet as a civilized dance, but the kind of idea of like how the object is then changed. When the ballet body approaches it in this idea of touch or intimacy, there's a sense of hybridity, apology, but there's a transformation. There's a moment of exchange. And so that's something that I've been playing a lot with in these works. And I love that you said, Elizabeth, that they're not actually touching the masks, because that's still part of the etiquette of the museum. You can't touch the objects. And even like making these photos, this, behind the scenes, like there was like two guards standing behind us just to make sure that they weren't being touched. And I just thought it was really interesting because we were invited by the museum to come into the space. And so I kind of really love that kind of like authority that's still kind of even in making this. And then of course I use museums, black and white photography to kind of think about history of photographs in Picasso studios or Stieglitz, but then also the plinth, the object that kind of creates value to the object. When you put it onto the space, it becomes an art object. It's not a performed prop anymore. It becomes an art object, but that's also a stand-in for the body. So that's a little bit about that, and sorry for being so long-winded. But in the other piece, I'm thinking again, about bodies in verticality versus bodies in horizontal space. And so when the performance happens with the headdress, typical West African headdress, were to support and protect the head and the body itself in a horizontal space, but also to kind of protect the ornateness of hair. And for me, I was just kind of curious about, this again, this idea of authority of a fallen body, which comes up a lot in my work, and a body that stands vertically as, a gesture of protest. So this idea of like standing up, falling, is part of my work. And so I started thinking about making these headdress as objects that are, similar to objects which I call devices that were in my Whitney Biennial piece, Master in Form or my show at the Noguchi Museum, the kind of like Noguchi inspired chairs in the dance, I kind of think about how the body is kind of supported, burdened, or conflicted by the prop or the furniture device or the sculpture. And so I think for me, when I kind of put these two together, I'm thinking about the body's relationship and the intimacy and touch. Because in the piece at the gallery, when we're watching the body, it is actually physically laying on it. And they're doing these voguing gestures to the sky, kind of almost with ballet hands, but kind of these vogue gestures, kind of trying to reach up to a higher presence, a space of spirituality, a space of sublime. When the dancers do it, they talk to me a lot about how it's very contemplative and how it's very meditative. And that's kind of a new area that I've been sort of thinking a lot about in my work. I might just stop there and let you jump in, Elizabeth.
Okay, great. There's so much in what you just said that's really exciting that I want to pick up on, but I heard you say the word stillness, and I wanted to talk a little bit more about that because I think that is something that definitely connects the photographs to the headrest. And here we're seeing one of the headrests, and we're gonna hold off. We're gonna talk a little bit about objects before we talk about the performance. So just for the audience, so that you know, we're gonna definitely get to talk about the performance, one of which already happened, and then there will be another one at the gallery before the show closes. But what I'm thinking about stillness is actually, Chloe, do we have a picture of As 1-4, which is the one with the female dancer who has her leg raised in the air? That one, perfect. So talk us through how you're thinking about stillness. Is this, clearly this is not an easy pose to hold. And you've talked already about how the kind of imperial violence of taking a mask from its place of origin and instilling it in a museum is a different kind of act of stillness. So how do you think about, or even, theorize stillness? Is this like abstaining from a kind of capitalist engagement and labor in production in a way, or what are all the different valences or layers through which we could think about questions of rest or stillness, both in the photographs and as it connects to the headrest?
Absolutely. I think stillness for me is a very important part of my choreography when I'm working with living, moving bodies. Obviously, it's a challenge because it questions an idea of like what is dancing. I think when we think about a body that's moving, or a body that's dancing, pardon me, it has to be in a constant state of action, right? Which then goes to a kind of a capitalist notion that if we're being still, we're being lazy, we're being idle, we're not actually being productive. And so I can try to challenge that. And I think as dancers, there is a sort of a masochistic thing that we kind of have to always be moving. So I challenge my dancers to not move. And it's hard. So I'll say to them, and this has changed in my process where I'll say, could you stand still for 18 counts? And then they'll count it really fast. And I'm like, that wasn't 18 counts. And they're like, oh, I did it. So now what I make them do is, so that they feel like they're laboring, I make them dance like repertoire in their head. And I'll say, like, do the Swan Lake Pas de Deux in your head 4 times. And then once you do it, then you can move. So there's still that kind of like technical kind of like going through your mind to get to that action. But that for me is a really important kind of question of like the ways that we're trained and the etiquettes and of what labor means in performing. But it's also, a question about society and how we're questioning our ideas of stillness. I think about, sleep when we needed, 12 hours of sleep, and now it's like, went through like 8, and now it's like 6, and it's like we need less and less sleep because we need to keep working. But I think about this photograph specifically, and I should say the position is arabesque, which is something else I kind of dismantle and question in ballet technique. It's a position that comes out after the kind of beginnings of ballet in the French court, comes more from the Russian court, and the arabesque is meant to be Arab-like. So I kind of look at also the colonial kind of like questions of like, what does it mean to be Arab-like, arabesque, othered-like? And so there's just that as a kind of a footnote. But also, when I'm thinking about the stillness, like I remember making these pictures, and the dancers after said, we're really tired, even though we're making still positions, we were holding this. So there's still an action of like within the stillness, we're still laboring, holding one's leg. There's fortitude in that. Even holding a hand up in, like a gesture of just like, even like this for a certain amount of time, your body starts to acknowledge and feel it. So there is action and labor in that stillness that I still want to make visible. But again, this is a photograph. I think about camera lucida and the ideas that, when we take a photograph, we're taking a moment of moving time and we've stilled it. And then we have to go back to this moment um, of, of almost like making it a memento mori, like, memorializing that moment of time that doesn't exist anymore. And within the camera, there even is like, there's those kind of ideas that kind of cuts the time, right? The shutter cuts the time. So I think about these as that, as like kind of in technicality between between the action of the dancer and it being stopped, because there is this moment of like, I feel like when we watch dancers on stage, we dehumanize them, we take away the kind of we forget about the technicality that that leg is holding itself, and it's actually enduring, and there's pain and pleasure as well, but there's definitely this act of labor.
Yeah, and what you're saying about photography is so interesting too, because this work in a different iteration actually began as a film, right? So it's very intentional that you've made these photographs, and this photography is act of stopping, but also I'm thinking about like the way that the photo historian Ariella Azoulay has talked about photography as an imperialist project, that something that conventional photo historians would challenge, that began in 1492 with a kind of imperial gaze, right? It's not about the apparatus of the camera, but it's about a certain way of looking. And that seems really relevant to the way that you've contextualized this content.
Also, just a little note, if you look at the whole series, the way the masks are positioned too kind of change their gaze. So the way that they would be like looking, or the gaze of being straight on in a museum context, I've just sort of like, that's a little intervention where I just kind of like, I just kind of, you look, some of them are looking behind, some of them are flipped, some of them are kind of like giving a different angle of looking at away from the dancer, or a directness. And like I've done this in other installations where I've actually had the opportunity to work with actual artifacts and place them within my own work. Like I'll change them so that when you're walking through the space as an audience participant, you feel like they're like looking at you in a certain way, that there's a certain kind of like dialogue between your body and their gazes.
Right. And I think really importantly too, that when you all go to the gallery, or if you have been already, the way you've hung them on the wall is roughly at the height of us in the gallery. So I don't know if you have like a museum glass on there on top of it, it's slightly reflective, right? So you can kind of imagine yourself, see yourself reflected back in that mask. I've also seen photographs or pictures of other photographs in this series where the masks are flipped the other way, and you don't have any of those in this gallery show. So the mask would be looking away from us. We would see the back of it.
Back of it, yeah. And I think that that's an important note. Like when historians now like try to authentify an African object, they look inside the mask to see it, for body secretion, to see that it was lived. They want to see that it was actually performed in, and that's the way of identifying them as objects that were from the continent and removed and brought into the world. Because there's lots of like, and I'm not interested in the what's the real mask or what's the authentic mask, but there are many like counterfeits, and people have remade them. And I was once in a farm in Nigeria, and there was this like beautiful mask object in a pig pen, and I was like, why is that mask there? They were trying to patina it to make it look more authentic. But going back to the way that of authentifying the object is by looking inside the mask, and for me that's also like a metaphor where it's like you're trying to find the mask, the face within the face that's looking outside. And so there's this other idea of like looking in and looking out, and so even like placing it from behind, you see the mask, it almost like wants to put your face in the object. And I have a series of photographs called The Insiders, where I photographed all the backs of masks, and then I hung that whole series at eye level. So they're all different sizes of masks, but they all are at eye level. So when you walk, you kind of are kind of confronted by this like human chain of masks, but it also is like you're walking into the mask and putting it on as the masquerader would.
Because we're circling around these questions of embodiment relative to the masks, let's shift those same questions and talk a little bit more about the objects on the floor, the headrests, because there are also kind of anthropomorphic qualities there. And so talk us through a little bit about both how you made these and their scale relative to what we might see in a museum, but also just help us see the different aspects of the headdress?
Yeah, I think for me, the headdress are really, I love that you said they're anthropomorphic. I designed them as a family, like a little like herd or like a little like grouping, and just so they kind of like, and I do that with a lot of my my objects that I kind of think of them as like a grouping of animals, a herd or a flock or something. They're a little bit larger than a typical headdress, but they do have that kind of ergonomic bend cut in them. They're made out of mahogany, so a wood that is an African species of wood. Their gestures are, as you mentioned, like very bodily. They're kind of giving me like this one is giving me like hands, like, and so I was thinking about like post life in ballet and modern dance. The club has been a very important space for queer solidarity, queer searching for queer freedoms in that space. And so that work is not done. But I'm thinking about, my life where I went to the club and found, so they kind of are like kind of evoking gestures that they're kind of doing, and they're kind of a little bit playful, but they allow for this kind of like seriality within this kind of family group of animals. Thinking about that in relationship to the fabric is something I've been using a lot. It's a Maasai fabric that is Kenya's nomadic people, are indigenous people that use this. The warriors use this as a textile, which is now kind of like their traditional like uniform. It's not indigenous to Kenya, but it has become a part of the culture. But I like it because it has this really intense color combination that hurts the eyes within the plaid, but within the kind of like juxtaposition of the colors. And it's a way of like creating safety and fends away predators in the bush. And so for me, it's become a way of like a visual noise as a kind of a protest, as a comfort. Again, think about touch and intimacy on a fabric, laying on the floor, putting the body in a safer space. In other choreographies, it became a way of being for the dancers to perform and be 6 feet apart during dances that I was trying to make and kind of figure out how to make dance in the pandemic. And so it sort of has become a motif that I've been thinking a lot about, the idea of like, what does it mean to be visible? What does it mean to be invisible? So this kind of hyper loud noise that can also kind of like camouflage the body. And so there's a certain sense of safety and intimacy that comes from the two of them together, and then the way that they relate to the body once it's being performed. And like, I was talking to Susan at the gallery, and I said, you could fold the blanket and make it into kind of like a pillow and tuck it underneath the object, because these objects are utilitarian. They're for the head, but you can actually sit on them. They're like stools. And I've also been thinking about like how in furniture design, because I make a lot of furniture that dancers perform in, or you can have it in your home or whatever, that there's a certain sense of like being low to the ground and a certain sense of groundness and comfort from that, which is not a very Western tradition of chairs. And it is a very African and South Asian way of sitting. And so there's this certain sense of it being a multi-purpose like artifact, sculpture, furniture piece, artwork. So I love that my work in itself can also be in its manifestation something that's kind of queer, undefined.
Mm-hmm. I feel like we're circling around questions that are going to relate to the performance. So maybe what I'll do is ask you a final question, and then we'll see a video clip of the performance and continue this conversation after people have had a chance to see a bit of it. But because you've already mentioned voguing and being in New York, 2005 to 2007, is that about the time frame?
I was in New York 2005 to 2017.
17, okay. But that early period is when you were at the ISP, right? The Whitney
Yes.
Independent Study Program. And so I wanted to hear you talk a little bit about, putting these different kind of lifestyles of being in New York together. So there's like going out, and then there's like going to the ISP. And I haven't heard you before in interviews that I've watched you discuss about kind of what the overlaps were, how you were thinking through art making as you were just in the city and like having all these different cultural experiences, especially when you first got there.
Yeah, and I think, I'm so grateful for my time in New York. New York is still a city that I, call one of my homes, and I'm grateful to have many homes. But when I first got to New York, I was in my early 20s, had just retired from dance, and so was not really dealing with dance in the same way that I used to. Kind of did a master's after my injury in Canada and focused on colonial, my colonial narrative, and then came to the ISB, and again, my family was like, my parents were like, you can't move to New York. Like, it sounds insane. And I was like, I'm going to go do this program. And I think my parents thought at first it was a job. And they were like, so what's this job? And I was like, I'm actually going back to school in a way. And they're like, okay, like, so anyway, I got to New York. And, like the first thing, like, I think the ISB challenged me in a way that, it was on, Walker's, like Lafayette and Walker. And, I was like immediately immersed by these vendors, African immigrants selling African objects as New York souvenirs. And I'm questioning my identity and my removal of myself from Canada to now coming to live in New York and in America, and questioning like, where is my home? So I think initially it was like this idea of like, oh, how do I make home in this new city? And so I think one of the first initial ways was just kind of, my research at the ISB was like working with people like Gayatri Spivak and thinking through like critical theory with Laura Mulvey and these and Yvonne Rainer, and sort of thinking about like colonialism, the questions of stillness in film with Laura Mulvey, but thinking about also thinking about ideas of dance. And so I started seeing dance again through the influence of Yvonne. And then I was like, maybe we're still friends, Dance and I. Maybe we're gonna like, because it was a very emotional breakup for me when I stopped dancing, and training as a dancer because I had a hamstring injury. But there was a lot of other things that I was leaving behind, like ballet can be quite rigorous in its cultural and racial and class stereotypes. And I was just kind of at a point when I got injured that I was like, I don't want to do this anymore. Partially because I can't, because I couldn't actually walk. But then I'm like, I need to kind of take a step back. And so kind of healing through my master's, but like figuring out ways to maneuver it at the ISP was really important. But I also love the fact that, I don't, I can go to, a lecture with, Judith Butler talking in conversation with, Gayatri Spivak, which I remember doing, and which was like, the Clash of the Titans. But it was so impressive, but then I can go to a Vogue club and dance with queers. And I think someone has said in an article that I am a queer punk rock ballerina. And I kind of love that title because that for me is just who I am. I got asked the other day, like, because I'm a professor at Northwestern University, and someone was like, I can't imagine you lecture because I see you at the club, and I'm like, well, I can oscillate, I can be different things. I am that kind of like, and I think that we're allowed to be many things, and I appreciate that about myself. I don't make just dance, I make sculpture, I make film. It's intersectional practice where it confuses sometimes, and that confusion can be challenging to define what things are, but I kind of like playing in that tension, and kind of being non static and kind of always sort of in a flux and change.
That's great. And I think, of course, we see that hybridity, like a kind of conceptual hybridity running through the work, which I'd like to pick on up after maybe we see. Do you think it's a good time to pivot to seeing a short clip of the performance?
Sure. I should mute, right?
Yeah, you can mute, Brendan. I'm going to share the performance here now.
So we'll leave the video to run for another minute or two, but with the sound off, Brendan, do you now want to talk us a little bit through about what we're seeing here. So, just tell us about movement, the body, choreography in this space.
Yeah, for sure. And it's really lovely to kind of watch this again, kind of thinking it through with you all about, and seeing the photographs in the background of the stillness and then the movement. I start, oh, can you hold on 1 second? I don't know what's happening to my door. 1 second. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. Some delivery person came and wouldn't stop ringing the doorbell. Embarrassing. We've turned off everything, all the other technology, but the doorman couldn't stop ringing. But I was thinking about the idea here of, the body's hands are still giving ballet hands, the kind of delicateness, but they're kind of playing with those gestures of kind of like moving towards the ceiling, moving towards and reaching. I love the way that I have to acknowledge, the labor and artistry and of my dancers, Billy and Tiffany here. Like they work with me, so they know my process really well. And within that, they are kind of like taking on their own risks. So I give them like in terms of the choreography for this, I give them like a set of tasks and things that they have to do. And then there's certain moments where they can signal and kind of communicate with each other. So you kind of saw at one part, there was no time, but they were kind of clicking. So the clicking is a kind of for me, it's a cue for them, but it also becomes like this kind of like magical kind of spiritual moment in the piece. We kind of just hear these kind of clicks and they're kind of just kind of moving, and that signals them to kind of then to kind of raise their bodies in a seated position and kind of move towards mirroring each other. But which is very different technically than how I would work with ballet dancers, because ballet dancers, for me, we work in a different type of technique and a different type of skill set. So within this, I give them tasks. It's more improvised. It's more kind of like they have to really be in tune with each other. Where ballet, I have to like count and choreograph every sort of detail. So it's kind of was nice to kind of see the difference happening, but then the hands kind of playing with each other, like the stilled hands versus the moving hands of the bodies. And I think then when there is no bodies in the space, the chairs in their stillness, the headrests kind of give that body of hand again.
And now that we've been able to see those performers in the gallery and see them laying on the floor, I'm really excited to hear you talk a little bit more about the question of horizontality and verticality that you already brought up when we were looking at the photographs. But in my kind of art historical mind, there's a correlation between the verticality of culture and the horizontality of nature, but also in like a kind of methodology of a global art history, there's a move away from thinking about like the verticality of a hierarchical kind of modernist center toward thinking about a kind of horizontal relationality within art history, right, as a way to kind of shift away from focusing on like New York and Paris, and thinking about kind of flattening the way that we look at where art is produced. And so I think all I'm trying to say is that I think there are a lot of different ways to interpret this question of verticality and horizontality. And I want to hear you talk more about that, because I think it's a really consistent concept that you come back to in a lot of different work.
Yeah, I think it's definitely about this idea of even like within ballet technique as being like Western hegemony of dance and culture, like it's the dance of the kings, but you always have to stand in this kind of very like your spine is very like elongated and straight, right? And even like, when I left ballet to kind of go to modern dance, it was like about being more grounded to the floor, and you kind of like break your spine and kind of rotate the spine, especially in a Graham technique. And so I think about that specifically in the kind of like the two differences between like ballet and modern as kind of like two different types of techniques. But I also think about it then specifically in the idea of like, the idea of like a body that is in horizontal space, is a fallen body that is then in a space that is again questioning like labor and rest. So it's kind of like in a fragile state of perhaps sleep, but it's also one of vulnerability of like fallen, hurt. And so, I started thinking a lot about that. Actually, the photograph of the female dancer, Lauren, I saw Lauren perform at the Met Op the Met Opera, a number of years ago, and her foot got caught in her tutu, and she fell to the ground, and the whole audience gasped. And I kind of made this correlation now to the work. She's still in her moment of like fallen. She still did her arms gestures through the whole performance until someone came and pulled her off the stage. And then I make those relations and the correlations to like Pulse Orlando and other sadly moments where queer spaces, queer nightclubs are attacked, and people fall and some people don't stand up again. And so within my work, I really think about that kind of power dynamic, the kind of idea of like the vulnerability. But within my work, I always have the dancer stand up again. So we're still laboring and fighting to get our rights to so that we're not falling, and to the point but we're not falling. It's a very scary thing for me to even like to say out loud. But the idea that we will have our civil rights, so that in the piece, metaphorically, they always fall and then they can stand up again. So there's that kind of power that we're standing up for our rights. And so in that way, that's a metaphor for protest for me in my work, to think through those ideas of dismantling power. And so even the idea to fall is like, it's one that we will fall, but we will stand up again, and then we'll move forward. So that's something that I kind of play, is like, let's fall, let's stand up, let's move forward.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, excuse me, the work that you were just alluding to, that response to the Pulse Orlando shooting, is Free Fall 49, in which a dancer falls. There are 49 falls in the piece. And that was in my mind as I was in the gallery, and also as we just watched that short clip of the performance played back right now. And I wonder if you can talk about the show that's at the gallery right now in relation to that idea. You talked before about the dance floor as a place of injury and harm. And I think we get that sensibility by looking at the work, but kind of contrary to that, we've also talked about rest and respite. And there's this maybe other sense of recuperation to this work, which to me is different than the Free Fall 49 piece. And so I wonder if you can talk us through that sort of difference, or if there's a tension there.
Yeah, I think, the dance floor, the architectural space, or just the floor in general, is something that, I consider a lot. When I work with my dancers, we talk through to give ourselves agency, to give ourselves value, because I think when I was a dancer, I would just dance on any type of floor. And after I labored on that floor would carry, would hit back into my body, and I would carry that residue of the floor. And so when we work with floors, we're always questioning, like, what's the floor made out of? How does this floor hit our body? How am I going to like dance on this body? So you never want to dance on a concrete floor. And so in the gallery is a concrete floor. So I think there's this idea that, they're laying on the blanket that gives them a bit of support. The headrest supports them. But then there is also the idea that they're kind of in this more contemplative respite, but they're still laboring and kind of communicating. And it is 2 hours straight. Like, they don't take breaks, so it is a longer durational piece. But like the dancers, will say, we always have feedback and we talk to each other, and they're like, that felt really nice. We felt really in our bodies. And I think I'm really been thinking a lot about self-care. How do I release from the things that we're going through in this world right now, and giving myself time and space? And that stillness is important. I think I said, when the pandemic happened, when we're in the full, in March 2020, everything got canceled for me. Nothing was, I didn't know if I could make work anymore, because my work is about social gatherings, creating, resistance through, a protest of coming together to dance, to find this joy. But now we're being told we can't even be together. So I was like, how do I do this? But I think looking back now, that stillness for me, being alone, being vulnerable, laying on my couch for a lot of it, became a space that allowed me to think through, to be resistant, to think about how to make things and move forward. So I think that this piece comes from that. I did a piece recently at a commission at the Barnes Foundation, and it really played on that idea of finding like spiritual space for oneself to take care. So the work is also about taking care of each other as body support, and think through ideas of nurture, care, and kindness. But it's also about an individual self-care as well, I think.
Yeah, thank you. That makes a lot of sense. I want to loop back to the question of hybridity that's kind of been threaded through our conversation, but we haven't really pulled on it as such. And I wanted talk about that in relation to this question of animation, or kind of giving some sense of embodiment back to objects that it's been taken away from. And one thing that's been on my mind is, I don't know if you follow job ads, but there seems to be an increasing number of jobs in museums for provenance experts who are going to adjudicate what happens to these objects that have, questionable histories. And it's obviously a really fraught question for a lot of reasons, but I think one possibility that your work suggests the kind of hybrid middle space where we can think critically about the history of these objects without having to give them back necessarily, right? Like they're still in the museum, but you're working with them in that space. And so I wanted to hear you talk more about hybridity in that context, or another one if you'd like, because I think that also relates to some things that are, as people become more and more aware of the ethical problems of collecting, which is something you've been thinking about for a long time, that is more in the public eye right now, I think.
Absolutely. And I think we're definitely in the space of like, how do we decolonize, dismantle, museum structures? And for me, socially and politically, instead of I want to enter those systems and find ways of making myself visible within that structure. So finding change from within. That's sort of my way of thinking through it. So when I'm given opportunity to voice and work with a collection, I try to kind of do it within those kind of hybrid interventions, like kind of embedding myself into that system and then kind of maneuvering and making my political dance, let's say. And I think it's interesting that that this is now a thing that museums are asking for, because it's a very complicated thing to ask. Who is that person then? For the most part, a lot of Africanists are European historians that have studied the continent, and so there is that kind of fraughtness to who has the right to, and what is authentic and what isn't. A lot of the masks that are performed, so a lot of the masks that are in museum collections, there are contemporary versions of them that are being performed in West Africa, but those objects won't be seen in a museum collection. So there's a lot of kind of work happening that still needs to happen, I guess I'm saying. But I think that for me, when I kind of conflate things, I'm asking us to kind of see things within new form. So outside of the hegemony of the cultural object itself, but kind of thinking about this idea of what is a new way to think through these ideas of dismantling, these ideas of giving a newness. And so I think even within the photograph of the ballet dancers with the object, there's this hybrid kind of idea that the body of the ballet dancer is giving to the African object, but there's also a new form, the bodies kind of coalesce together in a certain way. And I think that that's kind of a big part of my work, is kind of thinking that as a strategy, as a method of decolonizing.
As long as we're talking about you working in museums, I was wondering, this is just a purely factual question. When you took those photographs, were you working actually in the galleries of the University at Buffalo, or were you able to move the masks to a different set and photograph them there?
Yes. Sorry, I was thinking through, because I was thinking through doing the video piece at the Seattle Art Museum, and then doing the piece at the University of Buffalo. We were able to move them and photograph them on a stage, and I filmed on a stage in Seattle. The reason I'm kind of thinking through this is because in Seattle, I couldn't touch any of the objects, even with gloves or anything. They had their team of conservators, and the registrar was there, kind of all observing. In Buffalo, it was a little bit more relaxed because this collection was bequested and to the university. So they were still trying to find ways of how do we kind of animate this collection. And so I get invited to come and animate and to kind of research and to make inquiry on the collections. But sometimes it's I'm not the historian. I come with a certain sense of knowledge, but I'm not the historian. So I always have to preface that. But in Buffalo, we did move them to a stage as well, but I was positioning them, and then obviously positioning the dancers, and then taking the picture.
So what's coming up next? You have a long tradition of working in very particular collections, and I'm wondering if there's anything on the horizon.
Yeah, I have quite a busy year. I'm super excited. One of the projects I'm working with is with the Pulitzer Foundation in St. Louis, working with their exhibition of work of Scott Burton. So thinking about Scott Burton's furniture work, stone pieces, and kind of working with me possibly. It's still super new. I'm going in the first week of January to do a site visit, and I'm going to be thinking about if I'm going to make an object. I've been thinking about dance scores and dance language, which I always have been thinking about, but a way of inserting maybe one of my scores as part of the sculpture. So I'm super excited to have this opportunity to do that. And then another thing I'm working on is here in Chicago, is this project called Art on the Mart, which is the Merchandise Mart, this large building in the city where I'll create an animation loop based on dance that will project on the building for the months of September until November. So those are two kind of highlights for next year that I'm really excited about.
Cool. Thank you for sharing. I have one last question. So also just be thinking about if there's anything that you didn't get a chance to say that you'd like to say before we open it to questions from the audience. But I'll just say when I was in the Susan Engler Gallery, I felt this kind of sense of intimacy that I think that you have been talking about because of the access that we have to these objects being on the floor. I didn't touch anything, but it didn't feel to me like that was, prohibited. And I came in knowing that it was also a space of performance, but I didn't at all feel that like I needed the performance in order to understand the work. And I think that staging the headrests alongside the photographs really clearly sets up some of these bigger questions about colonialism and power dynamics, hegemony, and the kind of shifting of objects and embodiment that you really talk about in much of the work in your career. So with that preface about kind of what I felt, I'm wondering if you have anything that you hope that visitors will feel or take away when they enter the space.
Well, I definitely hope it's a contemplative space, one that, I think my aesthetic in general is like quite somewhat minimal. I think working with this pattern is the first time it's kind of been like really loud, but even within that, there's a sense of like contemplativeness. I kind of want you to kind of go into the space, feel your body, acknowledge what you're going through, and then to kind of, maybe it's like self meditate or, self-care within the space. I think also the idea that, when there's a performance, it's a certain kind of space, but even the space without a body performing, there's directives that you kind of know what would happen, but I think it also allows you to think about your body in that place as well. And I think again, these are objects that are meant to be used, and so that someone could acquire one and use it at home, or it becomes an object or a sculpture that can be kind of oscillates between being many things. So I love that about it.
Thank you, Brendan. Chloe, I think we're about ready to shift to questions if we're ready to do that.
Yeah, perfect. Brendan and Elizabeth, thank you so much for that incredibly generous conversation. That was lovely to listen to. And it was great to learn more about all of these works in the show, Brendan. We do have a few questions from the audience. I'm going to read everyone's questions on their behalf today. GE is wondering if you can talk a bit about being a restless being, Brendan. How does that push you to be in need for reinvention and in search of your own purpose as an artist?
Wow. Okay. I definitely have been identified as a restless creature. I think that again, I think just sort of, I ask my dancers to be still, and for me, it's hard to be still. So I ask them to do things that I can't actually do myself. But I really think that taking time during the pandemic was something that made me think about how to find that moment to really kind of enjoy it. I think right now in my life, I give myself time to just be with myself. Sometimes I'm always with people, and I'm used to being around groups of people, but I kind of like found this love to just be by myself sometimes. And so that was a learning process for me, for sure. but now something that I find a lot of value in, just kind of being by myself. So I think it's something that I've learned to kind of slow down through the pandemic. And so I think that's something that I'm kind of grateful for, never, don't think I knew that. And I even think in my busy life now with a full schedule of shows for 2024, I'm making choices to say yes to certain things and no to certain things, and to just say like I'm going to be home tonight, and that's also fine. So yeah, I think it's learning, it's rethinking, reevaluating, and making new choices for myself. So back to like new form of being.
Thanks, Brendan. Thanks so much for that question, GE. That was a great question. Brendan, another Zoom user is wondering if you can speak to the absence of color in the photographs and your use of black and white photography specifically.
Yeah, I think for me, that was more of a sort of a conceptual choice to kind of reference back to the history of black and white photography in the studio, the way that objects were removed and Picasso would photograph them or be in his studio working with them. So I think that was partially what I was thinking through, referencing back that kind of to historic black and white photography of being a document of a space. But even though this is a stage space, it kind of plays with that kind of idea that this is a document, that something's happening. I also love the idea, like, black and white, in cinematic spaces, like, like the movie The Wizard of Oz. Technicolor was the place where you were in the fantasy. You're in this world, that's this otherly world. So even though this is kind of like an otherly world with a ballet dancer performing with a mask, I'm kind of bringing this black and white space, which is kind of questioning a space of like reality, the space of like now. So it's just sort of something that I was just sort of thinking. And again, just for aesthetics, black and white is lush, beautiful. It kind of, there's a certain sense way that the ink prints on that, where you get these like really dark black areas, and so like playing with that kind of aesthetics is also part of it.
Thank you so much for that question, and thanks for that answer, Brendan. We got another amazing question that I'm going to read for you. Brendan, migration has been a large part of your personal history and your practice. How has living and working in Chicago over the last few years influenced your work?
Wow, I love that question. Yeah, Chicago is home. Again, I said I have New York as home, I have Toronto as home, I have Nairobi as home. So I'm grateful to have the opportunity so for somebody who was trying to like figure out where home was, I now have many homes, and it's such a important, almost like a privilege, that I have been able to find community in all of these spaces. Chicago has opened up a beautiful community for me. I have outlets here, I have supports here. I learned to also like kind of value myself differently here, and so I think I've really been affected by, the people that are responsive and support and allow me to grow within my practice. My show at my piece for the Whitney Biennial was a commission by the Graham Foundation, who gave me an opportunity as someone who just moved to Chicago to come and think through making, and gave me a space. So I think that those sort of early opportunities kind of like really kind of like allow me to feel and comfortable in this city, to engage with a greater community, and then to kind of like allow the practice to grow, and then continues to give back. I love that. We're going to continue to give back to each other. And so it is very robust. I'm grateful for myself to take on new roles here in the city, as a professor at Northwestern University, as an artist, but also like, being involved with the Joffrey Ballet. I'm an executive board member, but I'm also chair of the academy, where I'm really thinking through ways to kind of challenge queerness, and create ballet narratives for all types of young dancers.
Thank you so much, Brendan. Thank you so much for that question. That was a great one. I've got two last questions for you, Brendan, if you'll have them. One, your practice has always been so spatial and thinking about architecture and space. And I'm curious if there were no limitations, if there's a space you've always wanted to work in.
Wow. I don't know if there's a specific space. I definitely have like places, things I want to do. And like, I really been thinking again, how do we decolonize like institutions? And a way for me to think through that is like, again, spatially, I think metaphorically, like how do we build new doorways, windows, and pathways? So doorways to kind of move and create accessibility, through like, how do we look out through other windows and see things differently? And so I would love to be able to do that, like my goal is to like build a new doorway for a museum so that we can enter it in a new way, or new windows in a museum. So I think that's, it's a little bit, utopic, a little bit like, kind of like, but it's something that, could possibly happen, but I just love that idea that, those spatial relations to a building, an architecture, like matter, like walls and floors, how do we challenge that? I think it could be really beautiful. So, and yeah, I see G saying portals and vistas, it's like, yeah. And so like, even with the piece for the merchandise mart, like what I'm doing is projecting new doorways, portals, windows onto this building so we can sort of change the space. So again, looking at the idea of dismantling and finding change from within that system, but through new doorways, windows.
I love it. Thank you for sharing that with us.
Of course.
My last question is just, I'm wondering if you can, oh, wait a minute. This isn't the last question. There's two more questions, Brendan. My next question though is, I'm wondering if you can talk about the title Within Reach of the exhibition and sort of what you wanted to accomplish with that.
Yeah, definitely. I think there's a lot of like gestures of hands in the show, like the ballet hands trying to reach towards the objects but not touching them. The ideas of the voguing hands with the ballet hand gestures reaching to the ceiling, to the above. I think for me, it's again thinking socially and politically about a place we're living in and where we need to move forward to. So even the idea of moving forward is similar to within reach. We're close there. We need to get there. We need to find that solidarity. We need to take care of each other to make change so that we can have a place that we are actually holding on to. And I think that again is to the lack of intimacy, the lack of bodies supporting each other in the pandemic, in social uprisings like Black Lives Matter, in a Palestinian-Israeli conflict. I think there's a lot of space that we need to create to be reaching, to touching, to be holding, to making more connections with each other, like physical ones.
Thanks, Brendan. Thank you so much for those answers. We do have one more question that came in that I'm going to ask, if you'll have it, and then we'll move to our reading. Jeremy in the audience would like to know how you made the small stools in the current show. Or would he would like to have the specifics from you if you don't mind.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think Elizabeth asked me that question. I didn't really answer it. I went in a tangent. Yeah, it's pretty physical. Well, first, when I make my sculptures or my stools or my props, whatever you want to call them, the devices, I always start with a drawing. I start to draw, so I was like actually like physically making the gestures of like my hands first, and then kind of trying to draw it out. And then I obviously have like inspiration. I look at lots of different types of furniture, but I work with Navalis here in Chicago, who are amazing fabricators and friends and family and community for me here. And then we kind of started to like make maquettes out of foam core. So we actually like physically like put foam core together and made like the actual object in foam core, carved it out, and then kind of like made the changes, the finesses, and then reproduce that with the actual mahogany wood that was then carved. If you look at the chairs, there's some really rough edges. I didn't want everything to be smooth. I wanted to kind of feel the kind of chisel that was kind of removing material. So they're quite visceral, but then certain parts like the head, so where the head would rest, is very ergonomic. It has like a slight curve and it's sort of slightly polished. So yeah, so it always starts with like a drawing to a maquette to a version in foam core to then the final object.
Wow, thank you all so much for those incredibly thoughtful questions. And thank you, Brendan, for all of those very
Of course. No, thank you. I feel so honored and privileged to have everyone be here. So thank you so much.
We have a tradition at the Rail of ending our community events with a poetry reading, and I am thrilled to welcome Bob Holman to the virtual stage. An American poet and poetry activist, Bob Holman is equal parts spoken word performer, professor, impresario, activist, proprietor of the Bowery Poetry Club, filmmaker, and host of Language Matters and Beyond. From slam to hip hop, from performance to spoken word, he's been a central figure in redefining poetry beyond the page and on the page. And with that, I'm going to give Bob the chance to unmute and read us some poems.
Thank you, Chloe. Thanks, Brendan. Hello, everybody. I'm stuck on the FDR with my pal Jane. We're going out to Englewood, New Jersey, to visit David Henderson, wonderful poet and biographer of Jimi Hendrix, our good pal, a true Lower East Side icon, Black Arts movements, Umbra, go on and on. But why not read the poems? Okay. Because he just moved in there today. We were able to get him there from this Bedlam place that the city put him in. He's an older man now, and time to be in this, it's dementia time. So you know the story, but you don't know the poems. Here comes this one from 1988. This is from his book called Neo California. A beautiful cover. I'll take both ways. Thank you very much. From 1988, a poem called Miguel Pinheiro. There is a procession for departed poets, playwright Santo Miguel Pinheiro de Lower East Side. You were a fucking movie star, Mikey. Short Eyes, Fort Apache, the Bronx, on television, Miami Vice. In one season, they killed you twice. They scatter your ashes all over the Lower East Side, like you say in your poem. And they even play a fucking videotape of you reading the poem as your ashes take to the breeze. And then they had a party, a feast for you, Miguelito, Cumbia para Bailar. And at this party, I saw a Latina play an African drum along with the cumbia record playing while everyone danced. And there were others playing and others chanting in time. When the time came, drumming, chanting, dancing at the same time. And then at once, everything in the room became another avenue of time. Santo Latina rhythms on the fringe of the fringe. Bridges between worlds, between black and white. Mikey, cumbia para bailar. Okay. I think I'll read another one of his, and then I'll read one of mine about Elizabeth Murray, my wife. Where did this one go here? Now, blues as usual. You can't find. Oh, you can't find it. Well, maybe I won't read it. Okay, so it doesn't look like it wants to show up here for some reason. Oh, here it is. Organic pig meat. Obviously, the poem for today. We are concerned about the quality of life of those beings we consume. We want free-ranging creatures, able to walk outside and enjoy the sun and the breezes, to eat a varied diet, to forage in a natural habitat, to be free of antibiotics, genetic engineering, and growth hormones that make us crazy. They will enjoy their existence as a part of our being, and we promise to range freely and to be of good cheer, just as we demanded of them in their original body in one particular incarnation in this world. David Henderson, author of Excuse Me While I Kiss the Sky, Jimi Hendrix, voodoo child of the Aquarian age. And now I'm going to have to go like this to find this poem. I hope you can still see me, but it doesn't really matter because the poem is really what matters here. If I can find that. I had it, I'm sure. Is that it? Yes. Okay, this is a poem. It's ekphrastic, as they say, based on a painting of Elizabeth called Stay Awake. It's a sort of a map of it, but the time you'll hear all about it. I even, I'll even talk about Hal Wilner in this poem. Stay awake. When we'd put the girls to sleep, Elizabeth and I would often put on the cassette of Stay Awake, Disney lullabies produced by Hal Wilner. We especially appreciated the perfect irony of Mary Poppins extolling the children to stay awake, which in their consistent contrariness would lead inexorably to sleep. This was helped enormously by Suzanne Vega's loving voice. Bonnie Raitt sang Baby Mine on the album with Was Not Was, which Dumbo's mother sang while rocking little Dumbo asleep in her trunk. See, that's the trunk curling right there. The whole shape is a heart cup. Of course, there's a table painted on the cup. Often you find a cup on a table, but not with Elizabeth Murray, not in Stay Awake. Table legs are laces that emerge from the top lip, or is that an elephant ear? And from the trunk, and one out the cup handle, another ear. Stay Awake, the painting, is a musical instrument. Put it on your shoulder, play a little tune, play us a tune that will keep us up all night as you dream of a painting. Okay, so just to say that Hal was one of the first people to die of COVID, and we miss him desperately. And of course, Elizabeth died in 2007, and we miss her. You know, and that Suzanne Vega actually came into the studio when we recorded this poem and sang Stay Awake for us. So that's today's poetry moment.
Thanks, Bob.
Thank you all.
Thank you so much, Bob. A huge thank you again to Brendan and to Elizabeth, and to everyone at Susan Inglet Gallery who were so supportive and helping us bring this event together. Thank you especially to Courtney, who sent over the amazing images and video that you all got to see today. Thank you, of course, as well to the Terra Foundation for American Art, who sponsor this program and make daily conversations like this one possible. They also support our archive, where you're going to be able to see this event in a few hours. Currently, the Rail is fundraising to directly support our writers, our production staff, and our operations for 2024. If you're able to support us, we encourage you to donate at the link in the chat to help us meet our goal. And if you're free tomorrow at 1 p.m., join us for the last NSE of 2023, a poetry reading curated by Claire DeVoogd, featuring DeVoogd, Douglas Crace, Chris Nealon, and James Loop. And as is Rail tradition, you all can now turn on your microphones and say hello and goodbye as you leave. Thank you so much for joining us today, and enjoy the rest of your Tuesday.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Hello,
Thank you.
bye.
Nice day, everybody.
Fascinating
Thank you so much.
discussion. Thank you.
That's wonderful.
Thank you, everyone. Happy
Thank you.
holidays. Be
Thanks,
safe.
everybody. Bye.
Happy
Thank you.
holidays. Good to
Bye.
see you,
Thank
Safe
Gigi.
holidays.
Take
Thanks,
care
everybody.
now.
Bye.